Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only in America.
Only America.
Only in America.
This week on Only in America, where we bring you the voices and perspectives behind the nation's immigration debate. My conversation with Virginia State Delegate Mark Keam, a South Korean immigrant striving for a more perfect union.
I know what it's like when a government is run by totalitarians and others that don't respect rule of law, that don't respect individual freedoms and rights. And so America, if nothing else, America is the one country in the world that has consistently been true to its calling. We're still the only country in the world that still tries every single day to live up to those promises.
And later, when democracy gets risky, immigration officials demand voting records in North Carolina.
This board will, as required by our fiduciary responsibilities as state election officials, not stand idly by and consent to an agency attempting to obtain records and documents that violate the principles of overreach.
And the Attorney General's message to new judges: you are on Team Trump.
Asylum was never meant to provide escape from all the problems, even serious problems, that people face every day around the world. Indeed, Americans face serious problems every day, too.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani with Only in America. Mark Keam was 4 years old when his family left South Korea for Vietnam. 5 years later, they were fleeing the bombs and gunfire on one of the last flights out of Saigon. Mark says his memories of the conflict as a small boy have informed his work as a Democrat in the Virginia House of Delegates, having lived in both Australia and California since leaving Vietnam. In November 2009, Mark was elected in Virginia's 35th district, becoming the first Asian-born immigrant to serve in the state's General Assembly. He's since been re-elected 4 times. We chatted about the immigrant experience in America and how his life story has informed his service, empowering citizens for a better America.
One of the hardest questions I ever get is, hey, so where are you from?
Exactly.
Most immigrants don't like to answer that question anyway, because embedded in that question is this notion that you're a foreigner, therefore I want to know where you're really from, as opposed to, say, from Fairfax, Virginia. But in my case, it is a tough question because logistically it's hard for me to explain where I really came from. I'll give you a very short version. I was born in Seoul, South Korea. I left when I was 4 years old to immigrate to Saigon, Vietnam. And 5 years later, in 1975, when Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City, April 30th to be exact, my family escaped literally just in time before the very last flight left Tan Son Nhut Airport. And my understanding is after we left, the next day they bombed the runway, and so it became useless. So my mother, sister, brother, and I escaped. I was 9 years old. We went back to Korea after a long journey back to different routes. And my father didn't make it. He did not escape in 1975. And so when we landed back in Seoul, Korea, we were staying with our relatives and friends. And of course, this is back when we didn't have the internet. We didn't have fax machines. So we had no idea where our father was. The war erupted in Vietnam, and he was captured by Viet Cong. And we later on found out, a year later, that he was released. But for the first few months, we had no idea. Mm-hmm. We were getting conflicting information about where he was. So as a result, for a few months in Korea, we became fatherless, and we thought, well, we'll just live. And that was probably the hardest time of my life. And my mother, for sure, she had survived the Korean War, and then she goes to Vietnam. She survives the Vietnam War. She loses her husband. She's got 3 young kids. Doesn't have any skills to work. And Korea in the 1970s is not a hospitable place for women, especially women that didn't finish high school. So my mother had a really hard time struggling. Long story short, a year later, my father was released through negotiations, and we decided as a family that we should immigrate again, because Korea in the 1970s just was not a good place for people that didn't grow up in Korea. And since we lived overseas, my brother, sister, and I spoke English. Not well, but we spoke enough English, but we didn't speak enough Korean. So we were in this limbo as ethnic Koreans who didn't belong in their own country.
Right.
So we went to a Western country. Australia happened to be opening its immigrations at the time. So we moved to Sydney, Australia, lived there for a few years, and then eventually our paperwork came through, so we came to Los Angeles, California. So I've been in the U.S. since I was 14, but my first 14 years I lived in 3 countries.
Mm-hmm. And what was it like growing up in Los Angeles?
What was really interesting was when we landed in Los Angeles in 1980, 1981 time frame, we ended up in this small town called Sepulveda, which is in San Fernando Valley. Mm-hmm. And little did I know at the time that this whole San Fernando Valley, the Valley Girl, oh my God, gag me with a spoon. In fact, I think it's like the 36th anniversary of Fast Times at Ridgemont High. That was literally the boom at the time. And the high school, the middle school I went to, was located right next to the mall that they shot the Fast Times at Ridgemont High movie.
Really?
And so, I didn't know anything about American culture. I moved here from another country. And
you moved to the epicenter of American culture.
So I went from being an immigrant to a valley dude overnight. And so that was just a real cultural shock. And then a few months later, my father found a job, so we ended up moving to Orange County, which is
not supposed.
No, it's not. It's very conservative. It's interesting because looking back on my life in America, I ended up living in places just before it became a very hotbed for Asian Americans. Uh-huh. When I was in Orange County, not many Asian Americans. When I left, it became a place where a lot of Asian Americans moved. I went to San Francisco for grad school, and of course, San Francisco has traditionally been known as an Asian American place. But when I was there, we didn't have as much, although now I talk to some kids who graduated from my law school, and they tell me that the school is just almost half the campus is Asian Americans. And same thing in Virginia. When I moved out here 23 years ago, Virginia was still very much a white and mostly white and some African American state. We didn't have as many immigrants, so I wasn't as involved in the Asian community because there wasn't as much. Mm-hmm. But today, my district alone has at least 10, 15, 20% really? Asian Americans. So. Really? Yeah, our society is changing dramatically.
Right. So before we get to your district and the changes in Northern Virginia, so you get to D.C. and then you go and find yourself on the Hill.
Well, yeah, eventually. The reason I came to Washington D.C. is like a lot of starry-eyed young kids that are interested in public service. We're all inspired by John F. Kennedy. Growing up with my parents, who were big Kennedy fans, by osmosis, I saw John F. Kennedy as a beacon of what everything America stands for. And later on, years later, when I learned more and read more, I realized how pivotal John F. Kennedy was in allowing us to come to the United States of America. As you know, the 1965 immigration law was really the brainchild of President Kennedy, and he wasn't able to see it through, but Lyndon Johnson took on that legacy along with the 64 Voting Rights Act and a lot of the other Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Act of 64, 65. And so the triumvirate of the 3 bills helped create the America that we have today. And I, as well as millions and millions of other Americans of immigrant background, benefited from those laws that changed. And so with that ideal mindset of wanting to make a difference, I decided that I'd like to come to Washington and make a difference as well. So in 1995, I came out here thinking I might stay for 3 years and then move back to California where I grew up. But that was 23 years ago.
Uh-huh. So then how did you find yourself on the Hill working for Senator Durbin?
Sure. My first job in Washington, D.C. came straight out of law school. I took a job, that first offer that came in. While I was working at a federal agency, I was volunteering, pretty much all my free time I was working in the community doing grassroots community organizing, immigrant rights, Asian American rights, and Democratic campaign volunteering. And so through my network, I ended up getting an appointment during the 1996 re-election cycle. So I served in a political appointed job toward the end of the Clinton-Gore administration, and we all thought that we'd be serving in the White House after that. Right. Of course, as President Gore was not able to make it, and so we all lost our jobs. And I had a big dilemma at the time, because even though I was a lawyer and I was practicing, I never went to law school to practice law. I went to law school to learn about the law and how America's system works. But my passion has always been in the philanthropic world, in the nonprofit. I grew up son of a pastor, so I grew up in the church, and so I've always had a calling for community-based nonprofit and philanthropic work. And so when I lost my job in the Clinton-Gore administration after the end of the 2000 elections, I had a fork in the road. One choice was to join a community foundation that was developing a New Americans project to really help, galvanize and train new Americans on what it's like to be part of the mainstream, education, civil citizenship programs, civic engagement. And I was actually running it as a volunteer, and so they offered me a position to do it full time. And my heart and my passion was really in that work. But the other side was I always had an interest in party politics, Democratic politics, and I loved a lot of people that I've worked with and candidates I've campaigned for. And so one day I got a call from a friend who had just got together with a chief of staff to a U.S. senator who was looking for an attorney on his staff. I had no connection to the gentleman. I had no connection to his office or his state, but I just applied on a whim, and through luck and many friends calling on my behalf and kind of serving as references, I got the job miraculously. So I ended up working for Senator Dick Durbin, and this is right at the beginning of 2001 when Gore had lost, Bush became president, and you might remember George W. Bush actually was pretty good on immigration. Right. He came in with a very strong message of pro-immigrants. Being a border state governor, he understood what it means to have diversity and to be able to use the immigrant base as part of the economy. And so he had said all the right things on immigration, and we're very, very positive about that. So one of the first areas that I focused on as Durbin's chief counsel was to really focus on immigration reform. And Senator Durbin had drafted a bill called the DREAM Act, which at that time was called the CARE Act. Orrin Hatch drafted the DREAM Act. And so I helped as part of the team put that together as part of the package of comprehensive immigration. So I worked on those issues for a number of years. And in 2007, when Senator Durbin had moved up to leadership where he became the majority whip, I thought, you know what, I'd done 6 years. I've had a couple of kids by then. I was never seeing my family because I was working, pretty much 80 hours a week. I thought maybe it's time for me to step down and try something different. So I joined the private sector. But quickly I learned that my passion was still in government and politics and campaigning, and so one thing led to another. I ended up...
It can be a very correcting experience.
I ended up volunteering for this skinny kid with a funny name, as he called himself. He ran for president. I was one of his first volunteers, and eventually ended up running Fairfax County for Obama in 2007, 2008. And from that experience, I ended up running for office myself.
So what was at what point in that 2007, 2008, you decided, okay, I'm going to do this on my own? Because that's a really, really big jump to go from volunteering to putting your name on the ballot.
Yes, my first political job ever, my first paid political job ever was in 1988 when I was in college. I was interning for the Democratic National Committee here in Washington, D.C. As I got involved with the national campaigns and politics over the last 30-odd years, inevitably people ask you, hey, you should run for office. Oh, you're involved in politics. When are you going to run? And I would literally just dismiss it outright. I said, are you kidding me? People like me don't run for office. Guys like me would never win anywhere. I'm just a volunteer. I'm just a grassroots guy, just a behind-the-scenes person. And so I just always dismissed it, never once thought about it seriously. 2007 was an interesting year because President Obama, at the time candidate Obama, ran a very different kind of campaign. As you know, he was a different candidate. He was also somebody that brought a different brand of politics, which is that anybody could do it, that it's not about the candidate, it's about the movement. So it's not how great a candidate might be, how wonderful the speeches he or she might give, but it's what that person can do to galvanize the grassroots, the citizenry at large. And if you want change, you need to be part of the change. And so his message really resonated with me. And I had the fortune of getting to know Barack Obama as a state senator, because I used to work for a senator from Illinois, and I got to know him, spent a lot of time with him, both as a state senator and then as U.S. senator and then as candidate. And got to a point where I would consider personally calling him a friend, and we spent a lot of time together. And seeing him both behind closed doors as well as on campaign trail, I knew he was the real deal. What he said, he really meant. He was a grassroots organizer in his heart. That was his background. And so I knew that what he was trying to do was to create the kind of change I wanted to see as a grassroots organizer myself, as an immigrant who always felt neither being white or black, I wanted to find a place for Asian and Latino and Middle Eastern and Arab Americans and Jewish Americans to feel that we're part of the American fabric. And for us to do it at the grassroots level where we create that coalition. And I felt that President Obama's campaign really spoke to that. And for the first time in my life, I felt that there was a person who really wanted to see that happen. And so having run his campaign in Fairfax County, I thought, it's not enough to have this great guy in the White House. It's not enough to have a lot of people work for him in his administration. We have to find change at every level of government, including at the local levels. And so when people approached me along the way during the campaign, I actually started thinking seriously for the first time. But it wasn't until an opportunity really came up. And what happened was by 2008, I was literally campaigning almost every single day, free time for Obama. And I was campaigning for him and doing a lot of surrogate speeches and all. And so people would come up to me and say, hey, you really should run. I mean, if you're going to be that passionate about President or candidate Obama, we'd love to see somebody like you run for office as well. And so one of the people that came up to me was a guy named Steve Shannon, who was, at that time was my state delegate. and he'd been in office for a few years. And he came up to me one day at a campaign event and said, "Hey, Mark, I need your help." And I said, "Sure." He says, "Next year," this is 2009, he says, "Next year, I decided I'm going to run for Attorney General." I said, "Oh, fantastic, Steve. Count me in. I'll do anything for you. You're a great guy. I'll support you 100%. And he says, "There's something I need you to do for me. I need you to run for my seat." I said, "Are you kidding me? No way. I'm not going to run for your seat. No way." I dismissed it outright. But then I thought about that. I thought, wow, when do you ever have an opportunity where somebody thinks that you're qualified enough, maybe, that they would be willing to say, you should run for this seat, as opposed to just kind of rhetorically saying, "Hey, run for something." The fact that an elected official gave me a concrete opportunity, and then my state senator, my local Democratic Party officials all came up and said, "Yeah, I hear that you're running for a seat, and I think you'd be a great candidate." So that really opened the door for me.
All the news after 2008 was, North Virginia is, it's not your mother's Virginia.
Well, that's exactly right. And first of all, I'll just say, and I've said this over and over, I've been more lucky than good. And so I think I just happened to have been in the right place at the right time. A lot of the credit goes to people who saw in me their aspirations for change. But what I sold to my as a campaign product was my idea that my life experiences, every aspect of my life, having lived as an immigrant, having lived overseas, having dealt with diverse situations, having been involved in confrontations, seeing wars close up. I survived the Vietnam War pretty close up. I still remember the guns blazing and seeing bombs exploding. And so as a child, those memories are seared in your mind. And so I know what it's like when the government screws up. I know what it's like when the government is run by totalitarians and others that don't respect rule of law, that don't respect individual freedoms and rights. And so America is the one country in the world that has consistently been true to its calling. From the time that Jefferson wrote the Declaration until today, even though we've had many issues and ups and downs, and we've certainly had some dark days, we're still the only country in the world that still tries every single day to live up to those promises and the ideals of America. And so I wanted my campaign to be a reflection of all the things I saw overseas that tell me why America's so great. At the same time, to take my experiences having worked in the grassroots in America to improve those places where I know it can be improved. And most importantly, as somebody who wanted to run and serve in government, I didn't want to lose sight of the fact that this was a government job. And as much as people hate government and bureaucracy and institutions, the reality is the government is a necessary part of our lives. And if we can make it more relevant and more meaningful and more efficient and effective and accountable, I think that's the way people would like to see their government. And so I brought everything of my life experiences and my vision for what a progressive country could look like if the government does right things. I brought that to the table. So that was my campaign. When I first got elected, I told this story on the House floor the other day. When I was first elected, the Speaker of the House, a pretty conservative Republican gentleman who I've gotten to respect, one day stopped me on the floor and said, "Hey, Mark, I'd like for you to serve on a commission that we have. We have a number of different commissions outside the legislature, government programs and such. And I'd like to appoint you to a commission." I said, "Sure, Mr. Speaker, anything. I'm here to work. Put me to work." And he says, "I'd like you to serve on the sesquicentennial of the Civil War Commission of Virginia." I said, "Excuse me, what is that? Sesquicentennial? I don't even know what that word means."
Can you spell that?
Yeah, I don't know what that means. And I said, "And Civil War? Are you kidding me?" And I said, I'm sorry, you must be mistaken." And he says, "Well, it's the commission that we created to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Civil War," which of course, 1861. So this is 2011, and 5 years of commemorative programs. And I said, "Well, Mr. Speaker, with all due respect, I really appreciate your offer, but I can't serve on that commission because, number one, I wasn't born in Virginia. Number two, I wasn't even born in the United States. I came here as an immigrant. And thirdly, I really don't know enough about Civil War history to be able to add any value to this program. So, sir, I appreciate you reaching out to me, but there's thousands of other great people that you should find to serve on this commission." And he actually said something which I thought was very progressive for a traditional conservative like Mr. Howell. He said, "Mark, it's been 150 years since the Civil War, and I think we need to move beyond the old conversations and rehashing the old conflicts. We really have to talk about what it means today and the future of Virginia. And the future of Virginia includes people like you, not just blacks and whites. And I need you to be part of this commission to talk about that." And that was a pretty stark moment for me to realize that as the first first Asian immigrant, but the non-white, non-black. We've had some Latinos in the past, but they never self-identified. We've had some people with Asian blood who've served in the General Assembly, but they never self-identified as Asian or Latino. They've kind of blended into the mainstream European world. And so for somebody who obviously looks like an immigrant, I ran as an immigrant. Every campaign brochure, I talked about my childhood. I talked about where I grew up. I spoke Korean at events.
You owned it.
Yeah, and I mean, everywhere I went, I talk about who I was and where I grew up. And so running as an explicitly, blatantly open about my background and yet still being accepted by my community to be their representative, I think I felt there was my obligation to bring that conversation, to bring that diversity to something as important as commemorating the 150 years. And of course, Virginia has its particularly unique history of the Civil War. And so I spent the next 4 years traveling around the Commonwealth, going to meetings and talking about not only respecting the folks who suffered, African Americans in the slave and the horrible history that they had to suffer and endure, and those on both sides of the war who had to go through and lose their lives and lose their family members, and understanding and respecting that, at the same time talking about how we really need to move forward, because the reason why the Civil War ended and the Union came back together was because Abraham Lincoln and so many others knew that there were going to be better days ahead, that we turned to the better angels of America to create a better country. And just like the promise of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, we'll never have a perfect union because the world is not perfect and mankind is not perfect, but we can always strive for a more perfect union. And so that means every generation has to try that much harder to make it better for everybody.
So then let's talk a little bit about your day job. The assumption I would have is that in this moment in time, it's very hard to reach across partisan lines. Not even to like file a bill, but to even have a conversation. So how do you work for a more perfect union in this day and age?
That's a good question, and certainly is something that I think most Americans have that perception. And unfortunately, because of the media and social media and all these rhetoric that comes from both sides of the aisle, who on the extreme sides who paint each other as evil, it's easy. It's an easy way to look at politics as a bunch of people that can't get along and yell and scream at each other, and everybody's corrupt and everybody's just in it for themselves. And so there's a lot more negativity that comes from American politics today than there is. But if you peel back the onion a little bit, and if you think about the core, our job as state legislators, and Congress for that matter, and city councils and school boards and town halls, our job is to use the apparatus of government, which we've all bought into. I mean, we all pay taxes. We've all made the agreement years and years ago. That was a grand bargain that we might give up tiny bit of our civil liberties as individuals in order for the government as a group to protect us, provide us public safety, provide us environmental protection and infrastructure and school and healthcare and all the things that the government is supposed to do. So in that grand bargain, the goal was the government will be responsive to our needs and solve our problems. And we, the people, collectively will tell you what our problems are that the government can help, because individually we might not be able to solve it, but as a group we can. So we've forgotten that goal. We've forgotten that's the basic promise of American democracy and the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And so I try to bring it back to that level. And so as a legislator, whether it's a Democrat, Republican, independent, conservative, liberal, progressive, you name it, we all have a fundamental job, which is to use the apparatus of government to solve people's problems. Now, my folks that I represent in Tysons and Vienna and Oakton in Northern Virginia have problems that are probably different than my friend who represents a coal country near the Kentucky border. It's probably different than my friend who represents Virginia Beach and the tourism industry down in the Hampton Roads area. Probably different than my friends who are in the Shenandoah Valley with the wine country and agriculture and pipelines going through their homes. And so each of us have different needs that are driven by our constituents. At the same time, we have to work together to get 51 votes for something to pass. And so the art of negotiating and conversation doesn't start by saying, hey, I have this problem, can you help me? It's, I want to know about your problems. What's happening in your district? Because I bet you there's some things that you have that we have in common. And in my case, I try to make things as simple as possible, because I'm a pretty simple guy, and if I can't remember something, I'm sure most people can't either. So I try to make things simple. And my view, my worldview from a government policymaking perspective is that everybody in America, if you break it down into big buckets, probably want things in three big, broad buckets. They probably want peace, prosperity, and progress. And I'll define it a little bit more, but however way you define it, I think those are things that bring us together. I mean, we want peace, and we're not talking world peace, war and peace. I mean, obviously, the last thing we need is more violence and more fighting overseas, and so we want to bring our troops back home. That's certainly true for many of us. But beyond that, we want peace on our streets. We want our kids to go to school and not be shot. We want our law enforcement to be protected every time they're out there on the streets, because we don't want thugs on the street. We don't want drugs that are going to be destroying our lives. We don't want criminals and all kinds of different syndicates out there, preying on the vulnerable and the elderly. So we want that sense of peace and tranquility that comes in civil society where people respect each other. We want prosperity because, frankly, without money, it's really hard for people to survive. We don't want a system that's so skewed for the wealthy that the poorest of the poor can work all day long, 2 jobs, 3 jobs, and still not be able to put food on the table for their kids. We want a system that's fair so that when you work hard, you get a living wage. You get paid enough to be able to pay for your rent and for your housing and your cars and your shelter and your food. We also want kids to be able to afford their college so that they have an opportunity to go forward and not be burdened with huge debts and interest that accumulate. So we want prosperity that allows people to be able to move forward every single year, every single time. And then we also want progress. I think most Americans will agree that they want their children to do much better than they did. Just like that's the promise of America. Every generation does better than the last. If you want that kind of progress, you can't have it on your own. It can't be just, I want my kids to do better than I did. We want to be able to say, I want my neighbor's kids to do better than my kids have done and my parents have done. What that means is if my neighbor is LGBTQ, I want that kid to have opportunities. Just like if my kids were straight, I want them to have opportunities. If my neighbor's kids were Muslim, I want them to be able to walk around the streets and not be haunted or taunted. I want everybody to be respected, whether you're old, young, whatever your background is. And so that kind of progress, meaning that we want to move our society forward, that's more open, more accepting, more tolerant of each other. If we want peace, prosperity, and progress as a nation across the board, what's the government's role in that? How does a government help us achieve those aspirations? And there, I try to make it simple. I think the government's role is to provide educational opportunities, economic opportunities, and equal opportunities. So if we focus on education, whether it's K through 12 or pre-K or lifelong learning, 4-year, 2-year college education, apprenticeships, workplace training, workforce development for those that are losing their jobs, if the government can really focus on making sure that we have the most educated people, guess what? Not only will they be prosperous, but they'll also be peaceful. Because the more educated you are, the less chances are you're going to go look for criminal opportunities on the streets. And so education can serve a lot of different roles, keep kids out of prisons. So educational opportunity, economic opportunity speaks for itself in terms of the job opportunities, low taxes, low regulatory burdens, as well as giving kids a chance to become entrepreneurs and try second, third chances to try to become successful in their businesses. And I think none of that would matter if we didn't have equal opportunity. And that, of course, speaks for itself in terms of the kind of world that we want to live in. So bundling that together, if we as policymakers at the state, local, federal levels, if we focus on common ground that people want and common solutions that the government can provide, I don't see a lot of room for disagreement in that world.
My last request of you. So the name of the podcast is Only in America. So please finish the sentence. Only in America, ...
Only in America can a kid born 5,000 miles from here in a war-torn country with parents who didn't think that they would survive their own generation move around, come to Virginia of all places, and take a job that Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, George Mason, Patrick Henry once had in the House of Delegates, and to be able to stand and speak for people who saw in him their hopes and aspirations. Not because this kid was so great, but because America's great. And if America can produce success stories like mine, then surely we can produce success stories for their kids as well.
Thank you so much for coming. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ali.
Mark Keam is a Democrat representing District 35 of the Virginia House of Delegates. There's more about Mark at our website, immigrationforum.org. And let us know what you think of the show. Send us an email to onlyinamerica@immigrationforum.org.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the James Irvine Foundation, expanding opportunity for the people of California, and from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, established in 1911 by Andrew Carnegie to promote the advancement and diffusion of knowledge and understanding.
This is Only in America. I'm Ali Noorani. Before jumping into the news of the week, I wanted to talk about the National Immigration Forum, the organization that I lead. The organization has been around since 1982, and our mission is to advocate for the value of immigrants and immigration to the nation, which is why we produce this podcast nearly every week, because we want to tell the stories of all the great things that happen only in America, because we are a nation that welcomes and values immigrants and immigration. So, thank you for listening, thank you for sharing, and thank you for taking this journey along with us to make sure that only in America can a nation prosper, because immigrants and refugees to our shores are reaching their full potential. As you know, the immigration court backlog has reached record levels, which means thousands of immigrants are waiting to make their cases in front of immigration judges. So, the Department of Justice, who judges report to, is on something of a hiring spree. Well, this week, Attorney General Jeff Sessions gave a pep talk to 44 new immigration judges. He seemed to be telling them that despite the best efforts of the lawyers representing immigrants seeking asylum, the job of an immigration judge was to represent the Trump administration.
The asylum system has been abused for years. We all know that, to the detriment of the rule of law, sound public policy, and public safety, and to the detriment of the people with legitimate claims. Saying a few simple words, claiming a fear of return, has transformed a straightforward arrest for illegal entry and immediate return to often a prolonged legal process where an alien may be released from custody into the United States and possibly never show up.
Call me old-fashioned, but I think judges should be unbiased arbiters of the law, not Sherpas for a political agenda. As North Carolina was bracing for Hurricane Florence, its State Board of Elections was preparing for a fight with ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE officials have demanded access to millions of voting records from the last 5 years, poll books, voter authorization forms, and completed ballots. John Carella, an attorney at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, spoke to NPR station WUNC in Chapel Hill.
It does appear to be a fishing expedition for information that maybe is based on that very small number of indictments that they already have, and just casting a very, very broad net.
Now, call me a cynic, but any attempt by ICE to scrutinize the records of legal voters will cause some citizens to stay away from the midterm elections. And finally, let's get out of the big city. In every far-flung corner of the U.S. that I've been fortunate enough to visit, I found one thing over and over again. Rural towns with growing immigrant populations are thriving. A report that by the Center for American Progress shows the increasing immigrant population in Texas is actually offsetting the decline of native-born Texans across 412 small rural towns. Immigrants have bolstered the workforce in industries like meatpacking and agriculture, while also opening stores and restaurants and keeping schools and doctors' offices open. It's almost as if rural America values immigrants and immigration because their survival depends on it. I'm Ali Noorani. And that's it for this week. Thanks as always to the staff of the National Immigration Forum, and especially to producers Regina Medina and Emily Chow, and executive producer Kathleen Farrell. Join us again next week for Only in America.